So we've had an open data portal here for about 4 years. We were one of the first and we're one of the pioneers in terms of the data that we've been able to release. And we continue to add to that on a day-to-day basis. But one of the important things, though, that we keep hearing is it's not always navigable to everybody. You know, there's a huge, talented tech community throughout Chicago, and then there's a very special community that sits in this room right here. I'm not sure if you guys realize when I go to other cities, when I talk to other mayors, you guys get talked about by other mayors. They go, what do you do in Chicago? And I say, well, we facilitate as much, but we don't run the community. I stand in the back, and that's very intentional. I don't run this event, and I don't want to indicate that I do. So we've had this wonderful opportunity where a lot of you guys have been able to do special projects and to be able to contribute meaningfully to the overall ecosystem. But at the same time, there's people like my parents and people that I know on a day-to-day basis who can't quite do that because the portal's not quite there. So that's something that we've been doing since 2011. At the same time, starting about 2012, there was an internal project that was started by the previous CDO, the one who hired me, and then I took over his position, Brett Goldstein. And he worked on this project called WindyGrid. And WindyGrid was for internal situational awareness. How do we tell what's happening in the city? And it got sparked by a question from the chief of staff at the time. Why do I need to go to a bunch of different departments and a bunch of different commissioners to find out what's happening in the city? WindyGrid was a response to that. It was an internal business intelligence application, and it had always been internal. And there comes a conflict that I always had in my head. If this department, my team in particular, was going to go down this path of using open source, and WindyGrid did use MongoDB, which is open source, and it used Java, but it had some Flash in there, which kind of sucked, but you know, that's life. But if we're going to do this, how do we have this project that was very important internally, but in itself not being open source? So this was a bit of a conflict that we had. And a number of different things too, because throughout this project, we're getting feedback from users. There's 33,000 city employees. Several hundred of them had access to this application beginning 2012 going forward, using it on a day-to-day basis. They varied. Some of them were really good, like you guys, and some of them were not as technical, right? So they needed to have something that was a bit friendlier. And at the same time, we're getting this feedback from them, and we're tweaking this application. Well, this was a feedback mechanism that's also useful. Because of that difference in users, we thought, well, what about open sourcing it? What about taking this application, building it out, building a new stack, and I'm going to get into the stack and how we approach this. And what if we build this not only for our internal users, make it better internally for us, but also make this available to others? Because if it's useful internally for us to be able to answer the questions that many of our folks have day to day, and some of the questions are very fundamentally the same. What's happening around me? What's happening over in this part of Chicago? What happened yesterday? What happened last year? What's happening right now? Why can't we leverage that and use that also to help the public? And then also by making it open source, by being able to collaborate with you guys, to be able to add features, to be able to have these open conversations. And we've already had some great conversations today talking about trying to troubleshoot some tech. Steve and I were talking about some ways of trying to tackle some of the wonkiness that we're having with the ArcGIS, right? So this is helpful. This is helpful. So far, with all the open source projects that we've released so far, I estimate, and this is my estimate, but I estimate that we've had about 150 hours contributed to the city through pull requests. For people taking a look at something and say, hey, here's a new feature. And we have a number of examples of that. Some features that we had on a roadmap, some other features that we did not have on our roadmap, to fix bugs. So this is how we can collaborate together. So I want to show you the family tree. We have WindyGrid 1, what we call WindyGrid 1.0. This is something that you guys never saw except for, I think, 4 or 5 screenshots that get mentioned in articles, including one that I just showed you now. And then we built OpenGrid. So OpenGrid, as I told you before, is now built completely with open source technologies. Lots of JavaScript, basically. It's an amalgamation of JavaScript libraries at the end of the day, like many projects are. So this is what you see, but the OpenGrid code base actually fits into what we call WindyGrid 2. WindyGrid still exists. WindyGrid is the internal application, the internal fork of what we've done. There's some custom code modifications that are very particular to the city of Chicago, such as our authentication mechanism. The one that you see publicly, there's no authentication. It doesn't make sense. It's open to the public. Internally, we use authentication mechanisms, and we have different tiers of security. So we have those internal tweaks that are very, very particular to us that we call WindyGrid. So 95, 99% of the code base is the exact same. We do a couple of tweaks, and voila, we have WindyGrid. So when you see OpenGrid, you are actually seeing the foundation of WindyGrid. That means when we make an improvement, that improvement's likely going to go to OpenGrid. So this is not just a project that we shoved out there, and then that was it. We're continuing to modify it because we're also getting feedback from our internal city users. That also means when you make a contribution or you see something with OpenGrid or make some sort of way to improve OpenGrid, whether that's just identifying an issue or actually making a contribution, you're actually also improving the application that we have internally as well. So this is collaboration. This was architected so we could collaborate in the future. Not, here's an application that's public and it really only exists in the public realm, but bits of your code is actually going to come into the city and influence city operations. So we've been able to, and it took some thought. We first thought this is going to be easy and this is all we need to do, but it took some thought architecturally. How do we bridge this gap? So it's not just a public project, it's not just an internal project, but can span both regions given these kind of couple of technical things. So as I mentioned before, when you contribute to OpenGrid, you're also contributing to the public version, OpenGrid.io or Chicago.OpenGrid.io, but you're also contributing to WindyGrid itself. And by contributing to WindyGrid, you're also helping the city of Chicago and what we're able to do in terms of delivering services, whether or not that's public health, whether or not it's public safety, our licensing and Consumer Protection Bureau, all of that feeds in together. So when we architected this, we have these kind of three layers that we always refer to. One is OpenGrid, the user interface. And the back end here is what we call, it's not displaying as quite as well, it's called the service layer. So the interfaces should be about the same, no matter what we're doing, but we envision that there's going to be differences in data sources, right? We're going to want to use MongoDB for our internal version, which we do. We're also going to want to maybe make this public. And that's how Plenario fits into this. Plenario is a whole different project. Now, there's a few people in here. Can you raise your hand? We don't have everybody in here. Can you raise your hand if you worked on the Plenario project in any sort of way? Look around you. All right, so we got about a handful of people, about 5 people, and that's not all. Not all of University of Chicago is here because we got some non-Plenario folks here. But we have a handful of people working around the room and many others who will come to these nights who worked on this project. And Plenario is an API endpoint which combined data from the Open Data Portal. And we said, hey, wait, they already did the data storage work. When it comes to public data, they already did the work to bring that together and created an API that was kind of nifty. What if we take this thing that we developed internally, and we're going to open source anyway, but what if we take that and we put that on top of Plenario, and then voila, we have OpenGrid, the same interface that we've been using internally, and I'm going to show OpenGrid here in a second, but we also now are able to layer this on top of open data and layer it on top of work that has already been done, also an open source project. Now this is the civic tech community working together, right? But you also get the different flavors of OpenGrid. You get OpenGrid, the one that's going with Plenario. This is OpenGrid.io. And then WindyGrid, this particular flavor, which is the one that we use internally. But anybody else could use this as well. This is all open source. So you just take the user interface, you pair it with a service layer that you want to operate with, and which data storage you want to operate with, and you put it together, and you can deploy it. So we would recommend, if you want to deploy internally, you probably want to use Mongo. That's just a simpler thing to do. But if you want to use open data, if you're Austin, Texas, New York City, San Francisco, a number of these different things are already on Plenario, just slap it on top of Plenario, and your work is done. So this is us, again, not only operating within the public, but also trying to build off of projects that have already been there. Because, again, in Chicago, we're unique here. We have these projects that have been done. So many of these projects that have been done. And so we're interested in trying to layer on top of the work that you've come here to do or that you are hired to do by academic partners or nonprofits. So That's teamwork. Can you guys read the subtext there? I'm waiting for that. All right. So let's show you OpenGrid. Let's go through a couple of quick steps here. I'm going to launch this into a new tab. I'm going to come back to this page because I do want to point out a couple of important things. So this is OpenGrid. It's a map. It's a leaflet-based map, which gives you some really nice things to do. This was really important to us. For instance, if it was actually have some sort of rain outside, we'd be able to overlay weather maps very easily. And this was actually a really easy thing to do. Or we can take a look at what the temperature is, which basically you're going to get a lot of a nice, cool-looking blue that's layered on top of this. But let's just avoid that. If you're a real nerd, look at sea level pressure. So we can take a quick look at some things. All right. So we can take a look at business licenses. Which zip code are we in right now? 60. So we can take a look at business licenses. We have this quick search bar there because I think this is the future. I think the OpenGrid of the future is that quick search bar that I have a love-hate with relationship right now, because eventually people are just going to want to type in text and find out all the data. So this is one of those small steps towards that process. So here's the first 1,000 business licenses within 60654. All right, this is nice, and it's cute, and you can do things like look for the Wrigley Building. And if you type a fully qualified address, you can get other buildings as well, such as my office, 333 South State Street, Chicago, Illinois, 60604. Right? You just have to type in 1,000 letters. And so already we know where one of the weak points are, is the freaking ArcGIS geocoder. But so this is one way to interact with it. But really how we interact with it within the city of Chicago is through this so-called advanced search feature. Now, one thing that we want to do is we want to put some common queries out there. And this is actually one area where we'd love your feedback. We have a list of common queries here that might be just interesting. One thing that OpenGrid can do, it can, like anything else, it can tell where you're at. We don't store that information. We use normal geolocating processes. So let's take a look at Open 311 requests around us right now. And let me just do a quick peek here. I'm looking at a radius of 1/8 of a mile. That's not too much. Let's extend that out to 3/4 of a mile, huh? So as we start pulling in the records, this is 3/4 of a mile around us. It has our geolocation a little bit off. It has us on the other side of the river, but that's just how it goes. Every single one of these colors represents a different type of service request. So this is a quick way where we can pull up service requests by using this common query. And we're interested in seeing what other common queries there might be, so we can just preload them. You know, why even make somebody go through the hurdles of a query? Just give them the answer that they're looking for. So you can take a look at there, things that we thought might be broadly interesting, filming locations across Chicago, to look at where Dick Wolf is going to be filming his next thing. Street closures, potholes near me, restaurants passing initial inspection, which is interesting because these are restaurants that are probably going to be open soon if they pass an initial inspection. But you can build your own query as well. Let me actually clear everything out. You can build your own query by adding your own data sets. So for instance, we imagine crime is going to be popular. And you know, what happens when crime and streetlights are out? There's one streetlight out. And here's when all streetlights are out. If you're interested in seeing this happen, there were stories on this not that long ago about streetlights being out and potentially crime. There's some reasonable sense that make these things go together. And you can build queries, so you can do further filtering on top of this as well using these drop-down menus. So you can build the queries as you were. We think this is easier than it has been, you know, making that forward progress from what you have to do with the data portal. If you did it on the data portal, you'd have to download these things, mash them together, and be able to then map it in some sort of way. So we also want to look at a drawn extent. So we want to draw on the map and look at particular areas in Chicago. So I'll look at a drawn extent, and I'll zoom out a little bit here. I'll take a drawn extent here in the big loop area, and then I'll just use a kind of made up shape. So when we run this query, it should only appear within those areas. This works on a phone too. So you can draw on a map on your phone and take a look at it.
Lightning, I'll give it.
And you can pull this up in this what we call the grid. So you can take a look at the results at the row level detail. You can obviously click on the results if you want. But you can also try to find it here. And you can also filter here if you want. I'm looking at crimes, for instance. What's the word? CTA, right? Some of these crimes occur on CTA trains or bus stops. So I can further filter really quick to look for results I'm looking for. And then I can go through and I can click on the dots as well to be able to pull it up. For those who love their heat maps, you can make a heat map of these things. Let me zoom out just to capture the results there. Well, I got a bunch of those dots. That's not fun. So I'm doing a heat map of crimes. So let me take off all the dots and just let me take a look at the heat map. So if I want to get rid of the heat map and I just want to take a look at the dots, I can do that as well. I didn't color these dots differently, so it's all a homogeneous color. You can also do some basic graphing. This is actually something that we're going to do better. We're going to take a lot of notes from the Planario project here. But of the areas that I looked at, if I want to look at a simple pie graph of the ward of where these crimes took place at, I can just select that little graphing feature and I can create these little pie charts. So I can see that in Ward 24 there was 45 crimes. And those are just within the areas I selected. I didn't select all the wards perfectly. But if I did want to look at something by ward, I can actually take a look at selection within a ward. So if I do want to take a look at all this data, but only in Ward 24 because 24 was the biggest part of the pie chart, I can modify the query to do that as well. I'm using the same parameters, same 311 data, same crime as well. So now I'm just looking at Ward 24. And again, I can pull up this data. And I said, okay, now I have something I want, and I actually want to keep this, and I do want to mess with the data. I can download that into CSV, Excel, or PDF if you then want to run a scraper on the PDF. It's actually really good practice if you really want to scrape from a PDF. Get it from a machine readable, put it into a PDF, and then re-scrape it. Rube Goldberg would be just so happy with what you've done. And then you can select columns. You can do all these other little things. Now, if you do want to take a look, let me go back. Just one second here. Let me clear off my query. And let me just do something really quick across the city. Let me just look at all the filming locations. And also, when you use the common query, it populates the query, so it teaches you how you can build a query. That's our other hope as well. It gets you something interesting, and you can see the principal components of it. So we're going to take a look at the filming locations across the city of Chicago. And then as soon as you have it, you can make a heat map. We already discussed that. Such as that, yeah, heat maps. But you can also look at a tile map as well. So we selected the tile map feature, which more or less is showing a very similar thing as you've done before. Thank you, Chris. So these are the principal components of what we're taking a look at here. And let me just take off everything that we've done so far. So I've zoomed back into where our location is at. So you can draw on the map. You can take a look at contextually what's happening around you. You can look at things that are happening across the entire city. So one of the things that we hear from people, I use the Open Data Portal to take a look at data of the neighborhood I'm thinking about moving to. Well, this makes an operation like this much easier. Because I did that too. I looked at the crimes, I went to this other data set, looked at that, and I kind of pieced it together, but yeah, maybe, right? So this is how we're able to bring it together, but again, this is the one that's running against Planario. So by Planario being there, we were able to build on top of that, which gets us back to teamwork. But for us to be able to do that, we had to form another partnership. We had to work with the Smart Chicago Collaborative to be able to build that component out, because we were interested in Mongo, we were interested in the case that we had in the city of Chicago, but then we ended up talking with Dan. So I'd like to turn over to Dan to talk about his bit and what Smart Chicago Collaborative was able to do.
Awesome. This is so OpenGrid is a real testament to Tom and his leadership at the city and his team, and this vision that he described of building on existing things like Plenario that people in this room have made, people in this city have made. This city has a long history of being a leader in mapping, for the public good. I want to talk a little bit about that today, but first I want to talk about, Smart Chicago Collaborative. I know I've worked with, if we had a show of hands of the people I've worked with here in this room, it'd be a lot of hands, right? Anybody here ever worked with Smart Chicago Collaborative? All right. And we'd also be remiss, it's awesome that there's filming here, we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the fact that there's someone in this room who has filmed hundreds of hours of this meeting. And that name of that person is Christopher Whittaker. When we, 3-4 years ago, bought him a junky webcam and sent him over here to do that. So we have hundreds of hours on the Smart Chicago Collaborative YouTube website of incredible meetings that have happened in this really great Chi-Hack night. So one thing that at Smart Chicago Collaborative, we're a civic tech organization that is pretty comprehensive and kind of different than most that we've seen. We focus on access to the internet because we think that's at the core of everything. You can make all the maps you want, all the technology you want, shove it out into the world, and if nobody has an internet access, nobody will be able to do anything with it. We focus on digital skills quite a bit because if you have connection to the internet and you don't know how to use it, that's really of not much use to you either. So it's access skills and then data, projects like this that we really care about. So we have a software philosophy, and I really encourage everybody here to develop your own software philosophy. Why do you make software, and how do you make it, and what is your underlying philosophy for the creation of software? And our software philosophy is that we create the smallest amount of software. We believe in making the smallest amount of software to be useful to the largest amount of people and connecting residents to their government, their institutions, and each other. And this is a great example of that. At Smart Chicago, when Tom was talking about the service layer, that's all we did. We helped them think about it. We created that service layer with a vendor by the name of U-Turn Data Solutions that does great stuff. They handle all of our Amazon Web Services stuff. We have for years offered free hosting on Amazon Web Service for lots of people. Anybody here have ever used the Amazon Web Hosting? Wow, really? Cool. So I've never met some of you that what's the site that you have? Oh, no, I mean on Smart Chicago. I meant on the Smart Chicago thing. For free. For free, Steve.
Or Heroku, I think.
Heroku, Mapbox, all sorts of stuff. Anyway, the point is that we try to be as helpful as we can with the littlest amount that we could possibly have. And that's what we did. We really didn't do all that much. It was the incredibly great work of Plenario, the incredibly solid conceptual model that Tom and his team came up with, and the great work of WindyGrid and the city contractors that worked on WindyGrid. So we just did a little. We took that existing work, we're expanding the field with new civic tech developers, with companies that are already in the field but don't know about this particular field, improving on existing work. I mean, once people start whacking up against your website, there might be some problems that you'll learn. That's a normal tech project. We certainly found that in Plenario, and certainly found that in a lot of the things that we're trying to work on, and just proving the value. Before I hand it back over to Tom, I just wanted to talk some history and perspective. As I said, Chicago has a great history of creating map-based websites that seek to show you for situational awareness. Going back at least to the Chicago Police Department ClearPath website that was launched in 1996 on Windows 95. You could go into a police station and go to a terminal and use a Windows 95 machine and look up dots on a map. And Adrian Hollivati in May 2005, everybody ever seen chicagocrime.org? So yeah, chicagocrime.org right here in Chicago, before there was ever a Google Maps API. My colleague, Adrian Hollivati, created chicagocrime.org. Again, taking the incredible work of government employees, government technologists that did all that ClearPath stuff, right? And of course, now we look at ClearPath, we like to laugh at it, and we like to think that it's, an ancient beast. It is the basis upon which all of this is going on. It's really important to remember our history here in Chicago. That stuff is incredibly important. And then I started a project called Chicago Works for You. That was in 2005 for the previous mayor. There used to be another mayor. Did you know that? In Chicago, there used to be a different mayor. It's crazy. It's good to remember these things. Just to say these things out loud sometimes, So we had another mayor in May 2005, and I was a technologist, and I created this project called Chicago Works for You. It looks pretty similar, right? Just dots on a map, took building permits, stuff like that. It was scrapped. It never got launched. But that's life. So, and then I hooked up with my friend Adrian Hollivati, and we started with some others. EveryBlock. If anybody's ever seen EveryBlockcom, it was a website in 2007 to 2008 that pulled together local news and public information. Again, dots on a map. Same kind of stuff. And it turns out, so the last thing I want to leave you with is, at Smart Chicago, the more work I do, the more technology I make, the more people I interact with, the more crap I try to do to help let technology make lives better here in Chicago, for the 1.9 million of them that aren't in this room, the more I do that, the more I find it's the basic digital skills that really matters. And going out and finding those people and finding out what it is that they need. Because it turns out that all these dots on a map haven't led to communion among the police and the people. And the police are killing our youth in this city, right? There are no dots on any map that stop that from happening. There's no set of crime statistics that stop that from happening. So we have to find ways to have communion with those people who aren't here, okay? When I found out where Laquan McDonald was killed, and you probably saw the video too, it looks like a desolate spot, doesn't it? It's an odd, space. So I looked it up on a map. It's a block away from Kronos Euros. It's a half block away from the Greater Chicago Food Depository. It's right in front of a place called Focal Point Lighting. It employs 400 Chicagoans. It's actually a vigorous place in this city, Archer Heights, full of economic development. There aren't any dots on a map that could tell you that. That can't tell you what it feels like to go to work there, and what it feels like to not be in communion with your city. So with that, I'll turn it back over, and let's keep talking.
So just to wrap it up here, the thing I want to kind of impress upon is building on top of each other in collaboration, because that's the underlying thing that is important about this project. I have a mapping service now that hopefully is going to be more user-friendly. But to be able to build upon that, it needs to be collaboration from here on out. And so our OpenGrid development, in sum total, probably about $250,000. Plenaria, I asked about that team, and they spent about $350,000 for that work. So in total now, we have this project that's greater than the investment of the city of Chicago made. Right? And that's really important. This whole entire notion that we spent a little bit of money and we're able to get a lot more out of it because somebody else already did the work. That's the point of open source. That's the point of this community. And we're really happy that we have a good example of that at this point. Because at the end of the day, it's really priceless. I did this presentation 2 minutes before I showed up, and I'm just I'm remembering commercials I saw once and just bring it all together.
Posters, Tom.
And it's really very helpful. We're running this on AWS. The City of Chicago won an award last year. We didn't talk about it much, but we have $50,000 of free AWS time. And so this is also going to transform us internally as well, of reshaping how we're doing our deployments and our internal operations that we don't really talk about publicly that much. But I told you I want to bring you back to this page to close it up with. What Smart Chicago Collaborative built was the service layer here, a bit of Java code that can talk to Plenario as opposed to talking to Mongo. For the tech folks, between the service layer and the user interface, there's an API that's discussing with each other. So as long as you can get to the point where the API can understand the data it's being handed, no matter what the data source is, OpenGrid can work. And so whether or not it's Mongo, whether or not it's Plenario, another data source, Hadoop, whatever the technology might be at the time, that's how we're going to be able to evolve this over a period of time. But to be able to do this well, we need to document well. So for instance, when we take a look at the API that's talking between the service layer and the UI, we have this user documentation, but not only just for the developers, but also for the end users as well. So there's pretty robust documentation here for the end users. And we'll be producing videos and things like that to be able to help out. But as we go forward, what I'm going to be very interested in, especially with this community, because now we have this ability. We've intentionally architected it so we can collaborate with you to give us feedback of where the issues are. And if you want to be able to give feedback where the issues, many of you know where it's going to be at. It's going to be on our issue tracker. So if you see bugs, we want to hear about it on the repo, right? Because when we architect it this way, when we go through this extent, it's now an experiment of how much is the community willing to work with us on this. This is one, if not the only city where we're going to be able to do this sort of experiment. We're going to also be doing something a little bit different. You're going to be able to discuss with us through email. We have a Google form as well, so if you want to discuss with us, we'll be putting announcements there about future developments. We heavily use the wiki pages for OpenGrid, where we talk about roadmap proposals, big things. Like, do we want to be able to click on the map and be able to see a Google Street View image of where we just clicked? Right? What else have I thought about? What about natural language processing in that search bar, where you can just type, "Show me crimes in Rogers Park"? Right? Wouldn't that be just a much better idea as opposed to that filling out a big form on the side of the screen? What about, instead of drawing on a map, can we improve that process so you can choose an area to take a look at? But we're also going to be introducing something a little bit different as well. We're going to be having open developer calls as well. So other organizations, nonprofits, academia, those here, some of our developer meetings that we have every single week will actually be public meetings as well. You'll be able to dial in. So if you want to figure out more, you want to be more into the stream of what's happening, we're going to open up those communication channels so you can see what's happening, so you can hear what we're discussing as our next major releases. So you can give us feedback, and that's what we need. We've been working with City of Chicago. We've been working with those users they've been running off this for the WindyGrid version for a little over a month now. We've been developing this essentially over a course of 3 years now. But now it's the public's turn to get back to us and say, okay, how can we make this better? And how can we continue to improve this to make this a viable platform to navigate data? So that's all I have. OpenGrid.io, github.com/Chicago/OpenGrid. Those are the important links, and we hope to work with you soon. So that's all I have. Yes?
This looks like a solid plan for including the development community, and it seems like you're well vetted here. Do you have a plan for how to get the wider community?
Yeah. So this is also something that Smart Chicago does a fantastic job of, right? Civic User Testing Group. And so right now my team is working on formulating the submission to ask Smart Chicago to have a cut group to bring people across Chicago. And Dan has designed this beautifully of making sure it's equitably distributed, not just River North, Lakeview, and the Loop area, but residents from across Chicago that are not necessarily technically savvy. And that's our first stop to be able to get some sort of feedback into this process. And again, I do think that City of Chicago employees are also valuable as well to get it to every employee's hands as opposed to just the technically literate, because they represent that same, they represent a user base that is not always the most technically savvy. But between those two, those are our first two steps in getting feedback from a larger community. And obviously, by implication, when you have such a large release like this, you're going to get everyday people giving us feedback. We'll get emails about this as well. A number of times I've had an older person email me saying, I'm trying to find out where the liquor licenses are in my neighborhood, and are using the data portal, but they click the magnifying glass. It's like, I can't get this to work. I'm like, well, you just have to hit enter. Right? So we get those feedback, and we deal with that on a day-to-day basis. And these are real issues, right? No different than many people I know, including my own mother, would interact with the data portal.
What and how fast is your data set rollout plan?
For adding new data sets to this, it's going to be fairly rapid because of how Plenario is set up. We're going to be able to include more data sets with relative ease. So basically our big things is if we have a data set that has a lat long on it and we have a timestamp associated with it, it's pretty easy for us to get that wrapped into Plenario. Yes?
In the roadmap, is there any plans for integrating, like generating 311 requests on OpenGrid or generating other types of?
This is a really good question because internally in WindyGrid, we've been receiving that request for about 2 years now. And we've been thinking through, do we want to do that? How do we want to do that? So we've certainly been thinking about, because of the feedback we've gotten specifically from city users. And if we could start getting it from the public as well, that'd be interesting. It's very compelling to me. It's, if I could, I would at a moment, but it's always not what you do, it's what you're not doing when you're doing something. And that's been what's been weighing on our mind.
What was the question?
Oh, the question was, what about being able to submit 311 requests to the interface, right? So click on a button here and say, hey, I found a pothole right here, and just be able to do it from the interface, which is, again, a fantastic idea.
If the value of the collaboration is so high, what can people in this community do to just get these contracts directly and help develop it for the city and more of a direct and mutually beneficial partnership?
Yeah, so we've been especially the CIO has been pointing on procurement issues and ways that we can make that better. And I think there's a lot of experimentation going on right now. 18F has an interesting model. We'll see if that pans out. But really troublesome is, I mean, hell, there's a city employee and a CEO on trial now, right? The sins of the past is what creates these burdens now. And so that's a really tough thing to balance, right? Of how do we make it easy to do it, but how do we make sure that sons of bitches don't abuse it, right? Because at the end of the day, this guy took $14,000, at least allegedly so far, of just pure bribe. So we have to balance that. So I don't think we can answer that right now. But something that is interesting here is that we're able to work together in the open like this, right? Working together with an open source project. And so people can contribute to the extent that they do want to and not want to. The other thing too that's really important of how we design this is OpenGrid, again, is not only just for the open portal, but is also dependent on internal operations as well, which creates the onus on us to be able to make sure that we maintain it, to make sure that we don't let this thing wither and die, but we continue to make a concentrated investment into it while also collaborating with others. And that's going to be very key for this to live. So I don't want this project, and we see a lot of projects out there that are civic projects that won a hackathon a few years ago that, they're 404s now. We don't want that to be the case, and so we had to think through how do we make sure this investment can be sustained. To your first question about the Alderman's office, I actually have a meeting with them, their reps, next month, I think. We're going to go over this. We're going to go over a few other options. And I think in part, some of it's preloaded queries that is going to help them with it. And they're a big constituent of ours. Yes?
Are you going to make this kind of presentation to journalists or group of journalists in the city?
Journalists we did this morning. Yeah. All right.
Thanks
Thank you very much, everybody.